you did that. I just got a contract for the book I'm working on, Tales of the Quantum, with Oxford University.
Good evening, everyone,
Just today, Oxford.
and welcome to Wondustry. I'm Marvin Hilton, and I helped coordinate this meeting. And Wondustry is about using science, reason, and evidence to understand ourselves, the universe, and our human place in it. Dr. Art Hobson is our speaker this evening. And Dr. Hobson is a professor emeritus of physics at the University of Arkansas. And he has published 6 books about physics. One of those books is entitled Physics Concepts and Connections, and it's for non-scientists, and it's been adopted at over 130 colleges and several high schools. He is now working on a new non-technical book about the foundations of quantum physics, and I will be waiting to have a look at that. He has written numerous articles, given numerous talks, and writes a column in the Northwest Arkansas Times, which appears every third Sunday. And it appears in the opinion section, and I believe it's in the sports section also.
Of the Northwest Arkansas.
I don't
of the
quite
Times.
understand that, but
Yeah.
that's where it is. His column of August the 18th, 2013, was entitled Ideology and the Human Condition, the Strongest Force for Ignorance is Fundamentalist Religion. And that also is the title of his talk this evening. And I think we're very fortunate to have Dr. Hobson speak out about this subject this evening. So will you please welcome Dr. Art Hobson.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. I always like to talk with Unitarians. I was a Unitarian for a while. I just decided I'd rather sleep on Sunday morning, but it's a good bunch. I came here for a couple of years. It proved the old saying that a Unitarian is an atheist with kids, because I had my 2 kids and I was a single parent at that time. And I came here partly because they could come to the Sunday school here. So a lot of truth to that. Science and reason and evidence. That's great. I like this Wondustry group, because that's what you want to base your conclusions on, and that's a big part of my message here. So I'm going to start out with a few excerpts. I'm just going to read a few excerpts from some previous columns, especially the one that he mentioned. And then I'm going to talk a while, which means that after I get done with the excerpts, it's going to be much more poorly organized. A contradiction stalks the modern age. It is the contradiction between modern and medieval thought. If we applied our excellent brains to the humane use of modern science and technology, all humans could be living like kings and queens. But our culture remains mired in medieval beliefs, harking back to an era when life was nasty, brutish, and short. The crying need of our time is for our culture to get over the Middle Ages. Magical thinking is serving us miserably. The world today appears to be under attack by irrational fanatics. It's blowing up all over the Mideast and elsewhere, including America. Although other dark forces such as political ideology and capitalist expansionism also assail us, the strongest force on the side of ignorance is fundamentalist religion. The most obvious headline-grabbing examples are Islamic extremists, but some, such as America's evangelical Christian dominionists, who look forward to a bloody battle of Armageddon and to a rapture that will snatch believers bodily up into heaven, are all too American. Christian fundamentalist opposition to modern science, especially in the areas of biological evolution and global warming, are doing untold harm. Even more harmful has been the Catholic Church's global opposition to family planning. Another prime example is the contribution of fanatical Jewish and Islamic fundamentalists to the Israeli-Palestinian tragedy. We need to think this fanatical global trend through more carefully than we have. It's about culture, religion, and ways of thinking or not thinking. It's about what makes us human. So what makes us human? Following the split 7 million years ago between apes and humans, we developed through about 25 distinct species. Two characteristics of that evolution were tool-making ability and rational thought. These abilities were well developed by 100,000 years ago and led, beginning 12,000 years ago, to agriculture, cities, and powerful technologies. The problem is, our animal instincts still control these modern developments. Think of apes with nuclear weapons. Many of our instincts are inconsistent with our highly evolved capabilities. Physicist and astronomer Carl Sagan put it this way in his classic 1995 book, The Demon-Haunted World: Science as a Candle in the Dark. And I always like to bring along a few of my favorite books when I speak. I want to pass this around, take a look through it, and maybe write it down for future reading. It's very pertinent today. He was a fine man, one of my heroes. Here's a quote from Carl Sagan, brief quote. You might have heard it. This is pretty famous and pertinent. We've arranged a global civilization in which most crucial elements profoundly depend on science and technology. We have also arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology. This is a prescription for disaster. We might get away with it for a while, but sooner or later this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our faces. Quite a prognostication, I think. It is blowing up. That's the end of the quote. Back to Hobson. It's blowing up in our faces today, partly because fundamentalist religions emphasize dogmatic, implausible, irrational notions that one is expected to simply believe, simply have faith. This works directly against the evidence-based thinking that can help us and for which evolution has provided our excellent brains. End of excerpts. So let me make a few footnotes to that. You notice I referred several times to fundamentalist religion. I'm really talking about fundamentalist religion, not more plausible, reasonable religion, the Methodists and the Episcopalians and liberal religion. Fundamentalist would mean roughly, and I'm not going to give you real precise definitions of these things. I'm not an expert on this, obviously. I'm a physicist, but something I have thought about and I think it's important. So I've tried to learn a little about it. But the literalists, religious fundamentalists, would mean roughly people who follow the literal or believe in the literal truth of their religious works, believe them literally. Or people who believe that miracles really happen, that God decides once in a while to fly in the face of the natural laws, just once in a while, for special people or something. Either of those characteristics would define fundamentalism for me. Liberal religion, I think, is still a problem. It's not nearly as much of a direct problem, but it's an indirect kind of problem because the liberal religions tend to give credence to the whole idea of Christianity, for instance. And once you give credence to religion in general, you're giving some credence to the fundamentalists who can latch onto that and say, well, I'm just a Christian, that's fine. Also, liberal religions tend to give some credence to miracles, to things that can't happen, that can't be. People flying up into the air, people coming back from the dead, people coming out of virgin births and things like that. That's part of a lot of liberal religion, and I don't think it's true, and I think it kind of rots the brain when you start to think, maybe it really is true. Maybe it's not just metaphorical. So if those ideas are used in church or wherever, it needs to be made clear we're speaking metaphorically here. Because people start to believe that they're literally true. I think that's dangerous. Now I want to take up most of my time talking about a very fine paper that I came across many years ago, 10 years ago probably. It's by a guy named Gregory Paul. He's a paleontologist, and this is published in the peer-reviewed journal Evolutionary Psychology. I have a copy here that I'm going to pass around in a second, and there are a few earmarks you want to look, if you want to look through it and look at the graphs. The graphs are marked here and stuff. Very fully referenced. I want to tell you about this paper. You can get it online if you can get into the university library online, because you can download it and print it out from the university library. They get Evolutionary Psychology, this journal. It's in the library. Or you can go to the library and look it up. Probably a hard copy at the library. So I want to pass this around. Oh, the title is The Chronic Dependence of Popular Religiosity Upon Dysfunctional Psychosociological Conditions. Sounds like a PhD thesis. Let me tell you what he's done here. What Greg Paul has done is he studied religious and social indicators in 17 prosperous nations. Those nations include most of Western Europe, the obvious large countries in Western Europe, plus Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and the United States. And what he's done is tabulate indicators of social success in those nations. He didn't get these indicators himself. He didn't take polls and take the statistics himself. He looked them up, and he has good references for all these enormous number of different statistics about things. So he tabulated 25 actually indicators of social success in these nations, plus 9 indicators of religiosity in all 17 nations. And he noted correlations between the social success and the religiosity. And what he found, just to give you the overall view, and I'm going to go into several details, what he found was a strong correlation between religiosity on the one hand and social dysfunction on the other hand in all these different indicators. I want to give you some examples in just a minute. In other words, the most socially successful nations were the ones that were the least religious, and the most socially dysfunctional nations were the ones that were most religious. And that correlation is not quite a straight line, but it holds pretty well throughout the entire study when you look at the summary of the whole study. Quite a correlation. The most socially successful nations are the least religious. Those most socially successful, the top 4 in order, are Sweden, Japan, Denmark, and France out of the 17. So you get an idea of some of the nations they studied. The least socially successful nations were the most religious. And those 4, the first 4 in order of the most religious and the most socially dysfunctional, were the United States, Ireland, Italy, and Austria. A striking feature was that the U.S. was a huge outlier in all of these statistics. We weren't the most religious by a little bit. We were the most religious of the 17 by a lot. There's a big gap. There's all the other 16, and then there's a big gap. And here's number 17. That's us. And that's on both the social indicators. When you summarize all the social indicators, on some of these indicators, they're much closer together. We're not last on all the indicators, but overall, we're last in social dysfunction, and we're the most religious, and it's by a big gap. Now, let me tell you what some of these individual indicators were. I think you'll see they're fairly objective measures. This isn't just Greg Paul's opinion about these different areas. Let's talk about the social success indicators. There were 25 indicators. The U.S. was the most dysfunctional in 11 of those 25 indicators. And let me tell you what the 11 were that the U.S. was the most dysfunctional in. And just think about each one. I'll read the list rather slowly so you can think. We're the leader in all these things. First was homicides per capita, and all these figures are per capita, homicides. Incarcerations, juvenile mortality, gonorrhea and syphilis, teenage abortions in a country that's so anti-abortion. Teenage abortions, number 5. Adolescent pregnancies, marriage duration, income disparity, poverty, work hours, overexploitation of resources. And the gap between us and the other nations overall on the social indicators was large. Now let me give you 3 more specific examples that give you some figures on some of those indicators. I just want to pick 3 of them that we were the worst in. And one of those is the annual homicide rate. In the U.S., that rate is 6 per 100,000, roughly. In the 16 other nations, the rate was 1 to 2 per 100,000 versus 6, 1 to 2 versus 6. The teenage abortion rate's another one. In the U.S., the rate was 29 teenage abortions per 1,000 teenagers per year. In the 16 others, the rates ran between 14 and 21, not the U.S. 29. Okay, and the third one that I've got written down here is the birth rate among adolescents age 15 to 17. Kind of young to be having kids. In the U.S., that rate was 34 per 1,000 kids. In other nations, it was 1 to 19. Okay, let's turn to the religiosity indicators. Here there were 9 indicators. The U.S. led in religiosity in 8 of those indicators. Most religious nation, including Italy, Ireland. Austria is pretty religious. Those 8 were belief in God, biblical literalism, frequency of prayer, belief in an afterlife, belief in heaven, belief in hell, percentage of atheists and agnostics, and acceptance of evolution. We were the most religious in every one of those 8 categories. And let's take apart 3 of those categories again. One example is the absolute belief in God. Here, and we're talking about absolute belief in God. And that's not just does God maybe exist, he probably exists, is there a 5 to 1 chance he exists? Absolute belief in God. No chance that he doesn't exist. Or she, I should say. I'd rather it was a she if there was one. Absolute belief in God. U.S. 63%, Irish 50%, Italians 48%. It's a little bit closer on this than on the social dysfunction. At the other end of the scale, Danes 14% absolutely believe in God, Swedes 12%, Japanese 4%. Second indicator, do you pray several times per week? There are polls that go around and ask people if they pray several times a week. In the U.S., 60% of us do, 45% of the Irish and 34% of the Italians. Those were the top 3 in that religiosity index. And at the atheistic end, 14% of Swedes, 13% of Germans, and 11% of Japanese pray several times per week. On acceptance of evolution, I just think this is pretty important. We've got to have better science education in this country than we do. And things like not accepting evolution and not accepting the high probability of global warming Geez, that's kind of crazy. And it just flies in the face of the evidence, and these are important topics. We need to know where we came from, and we need to know about global warming. Acceptance of evolution. In the United States, only 44% accept evolution. That's always surprised me. It's almost half. It's only about half that accept evolution. It's a little less than half that accept it. Among Australians, it's 55%. Among Austrians, 57% accept evolution. And at the atheistic end, 81% of Japanese, 82% of Swedes, and 83% of Danes accept evolution. So that gives you a summary of that paper that's going around. Pass it over to the other side when he gets back there. Hope everybody gets a chance to just look through it or write the title down. I'd like everybody that is interested in this to look this thing up. It's quite a paper. I'm sure there's other studies that bring out a similar point. So some conclusions from this. The first point that I think is worth mentioning is, have you ever heard of the God gene? The idea that we're sort of somehow destined to believe in God, that we're genetically predisposed to believe in God. That seems not to be true, because if we were, then the Danes and the Swedes would believe in God. Why wouldn't they believe in God? Just because they are socially more functional, that shouldn't necessarily cause them to not believe in God, if there's a God gene. But it doesn't look like there is. It's also probably a false hypothesis that religion promotes social success in a society. It doesn't seem to at all. It's just the opposite. The data points all the other direction. A correlation doesn't always prove causality, I know, so you can't prove this, I guess, from all those correlations, but there sure are a lot of correlations. And I think it pretty well disproves the hypothesis that religion actually promotes social success. If it did, then those statistics wouldn't run the way they do. It's a false hypothesis, for example, that evolution, looking at it a little bit turned around here, that evolution promotes social dysfunction. Some people think that if you believe in evolution, that's going to make us all apes and we'll be violent and we won't behave ourselves and we won't be socially functional. It seems to be just the opposite, just precisely the opposite. The countries like Denmark and Sweden and Japan functions pretty well socially. I don't know as much about them, but Denmark and Sweden, they work pretty well. I lived in Sweden once for 6 months, and that country works. It really works. Social system, the transportation system, the whole thing, the way it's set up, the city planning and everything. On the other hand, this data tends to support the hypothesis that people turn to religion out of despair. I mean, if you're socially dysfunctional and you got a lot of hungry people and you got a lot of people scrounging for their next meal and so on and so forth, extreme poverty, that's kind of depressing. What do you do when you get depressed? Well, you turn to magic, you turn to religions, maybe that'll help. At least the evidence suggests that. Supports the hypothesis that goes the other way, that maybe religion causes social dysfunction. That's the way all the statistics run. So for me, a lesson in this is that faith and belief are not good bases for ethics, for living, for much of anything. You want to get away from belief and away from faith and form your conclusions on the basis of what Marvin said at the beginning and what this group is all about, on the basis of evidence and reason, and not necessarily science. There's more to life than science, but evidence and reason have to play a role, a strong role in forming your conclusions, especially about social issues. So don't base your conclusions on beliefs, on ancient manuscripts, on authority, on old books, on your daddy's opinion. All of these things are good consultants, nothing wrong with them, to consult, to get ideas and suggestions, but don't base your conclusions on beliefs. Base it on evidence and reason. But you know, everybody needs a few, or maybe at least one, belief of some sort, a postulate. Logically, you need a starting point for any logical system. You need a starting point to form your ethics, I think, if you want to really think it through. You can't prove everything in any logical system. You got to start someplace. So you need a basis for your beliefs. I think that's true. So I'm not saying there's no place for belief. What kind of beliefs would make sense if you were to use it as a basis for your ethics? Well, there's an old idea that I first latched onto when I was about 20, back there someplace, and I believed it all my life, and it's worked just fine. I used to be somewhat religious. Now I'm not at all religious, but I've always thought this was a good idea. It's generally called the greatest happiness principle. It's just one of the possible beliefs that you can have. I don't want to try to push this particular idea too much, but everybody needs some sort of general idea of how to get going with their ethics. What should ethics be about? What should it aim for? Well, I'd say live your life in such a way as to help other people to be happy and prosperous and live full lives. Help all people to be happy and prosperous and live full lives. That's the general idea of the greatest happiness principle. But you know, you're a person too, and you want to make yourself happy at the same time. I mean, when I say people, I mean yourself included. In fact, maybe yourself first, I'm not sure. I think we all have an obligation to be as happy as we can, really. We owe it to our biology. It's wonderful that we can be here. And we sort of be letting the universe down if we let ourselves down. So take care of yourself too. But take care of other people. I think that's kind of built into our genes, taking care of other people. I don't think we'd be here if we weren't altruistic to a certain extent, because it wouldn't work out. You know, it's not going to work out unless we take care of each other. Everybody can see that. So it's a very simple idea. This is a very simple idea. This is not something complicated like, I believe in the Bible. Wow, what a thing to say you believe in the Bible. Everything in the Bible, every single thing in the Bible all the way through, even Jonah and the whale or whatever. I'd take something simple and pretty obvious and plausible and and then think about it and look around for the evidence and see what actually works in the real world. That's evidence. And draw logical conclusions, like this study is a pretty good logical conclusion for one thing that I'm talking about. I have a good reference, and I think this is a pretty good reference for the greatest happiness principle, because that's what this book is all about. And this is by the Dalai Lama. He's a nice man. He's a Buddhist. I don't have much disagreement with Buddhists, not that I know of anyway. They don't seem to be, they're more like a philosophy than a religion as far as I can tell. They don't seem to have any of these beliefs. But he states frankly at the beginning, he's a very nice man. I like the Dalai Lama. I think everybody does. And he states at the beginning, frankly, this is not going to be a religious book. This is not about religion. This is about ethics. And it's called Ethics for the New Millennium. It was written about 1995. It's still very relevant. And he uses this for the basis of his thinking throughout the book. I just think it's an excellent book, and I want to pass it around and let you all take a look at it. Okay. There you go. It's all based on this greatest happiness principle. He says that at the beginning, and that's what he's talking about all the way through. So a brief summary of all this might be that we're better off without gods. We're better off without beliefs, by and large. But that's kind of a negative note. We're better off without gods. That's a negative note. What are we better off with? So I want to enter on a little more positive note. People frequently ask atheists like myself and maybe some of you, But what's the purpose of life, Art? What's the meaning, capital M? What's the meaning of all this? What am I supposed to really live for? Well, I think that's not a good question. I think it's a category mistake, as maybe philosophers would call it. You don't want to ask what's the meaning of life. It's not the kind of thing that has a meaning. Life just is. You wouldn't ask what's the meaning of a roller coaster. That's a good metaphor for life for me, in a good sense. I like roller coasters. You ride a roller coaster. Why? What was the purpose of that, Art? What was the capital M meaning of that, Art? What a heavy, kind of dark question to ask about a roller coaster ride. It's just fun. It's wonderful. You experience. You get to meet people. You talk and you help other people and you interact and you get better at doing various things, and this whole thing gets to be more and more fun for everybody forever. Isn't that wonderful? Who would resist that? Who could resist that? To say that there has to be some infinite eternity stretching out there. I just think if there was a God, that she would say, you're asking for an awful lot, man. I gave you all this 80 years here, whatever it is. It's been 78 for me now, and I'm just glad as I can be that I'm here. And I have a great time with it. You wouldn't ask what's the meaning of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, I don't think. I don't. I just listen to it, and I experience it. And that's what life is. It's experience. Life is. It doesn't have a meaning. There is no meaning of life, and there shouldn't be. It's not the kind of thing that has a meaning. I think that's a good basis for living, actually. This might sound kind of weird and distorted, but I think there is no meaning of life. I think that's a good thing to think about, a good way to look at the problem or question of the meaning of life. There is no meaning of life. Live your life. That's what life is about. It's not about having a meaning. It's about the experience. That's a good place for me to stop talking, I think. And I want to have some discussion of all this and see what you think about it. Thanks. Do you want to moderate the questions for me, or should I?
Go ahead, just see how it works.
Okay.
I'm fascinated by the study you passed around, but I just have a question if you understand this. When he did his survey in Japan, how did he deal with God?
He didn't do the surveying himself. That would be a good question, and I don't know. He doesn't describe how the surveys were done in different countries. Okay. The question is, how did he ask the question about the meaning about belief in God to the Japanese? They might have a hard time making. You want to explain any more about the background of that question about the Japanese and belief in God?
So the Japanese were one of the four that had the best correlation, so that interested me how the question was framed to them.
Yeah, she was struck by the fact that the Japanese had only 4% of the people who said they absolutely believe in God. And she's wondering if that reflected some special way, or what did that say about possibly the way they asked the question in Japan. And I don't know the answer to that question. There are all these different studies that he simply compiled the studies. He didn't do the studies himself. But I bet you could find out where he got his information about Japan, and you could look that up. Yeah, John.
The anti-evolutionary types you run into, are they saying that God doesn't have a right to make product revisions?
To make what?
Product revisions.
I would think so. You may at least, I should say she. I've always liked that notion. She made quite a few revisions, 25 different species of humans, in fact. I mean, nothing's evolved more than humans, and then nothing is better recorded than the evolution of humans, and it's been enormous. And they keep discovering new stuff. They found Ardipithecus. That's older than the Australopithecus. Lucy and all that has Australopithecus. They found Ardipithecus, and it's just been revealed in the last year or two in Science Magazine. Science Magazine is wonderful for this stuff. If you want to keep up on your general science, I couldn't recommend anything better than Science Magazine. It comes every week. It's too much to keep up with almost. I don't see how they put that thing together every week. It's amazing. But we have evolved, and we've got all sorts of, I don't know if they're improvements, but they're changes. Phil, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Assuming that 400 years ago the Danes were burning people because they believed something that the rest of them didn't, how did they wind up, with a more rational society? And, in other words, where did we take a turn different from the Danes?
I have to say again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, so I don't really know. But I've spent 6 months in Sweden, and I can tell you they love books. There's a bibliothèque in the middle of every little suburb around Stockholm. I mean, not just in Stockholm. Every little suburb, they make a point of having a library, and they have planned suburbs out along the subway lines wherever they go. Every stop is a suburb that's been planned. It's a little village. It's been planned. They're separated by about a 15-minute walk or so between different suburbs, and there's grass and parks. It's just Stockholm is a wonderful, wonderful city, and very intelligently planned. So you can see evidence of the way they use their brains there, and the way their cities are laid out. And you see a lot of reading the newspapers, a lot of discussion of intelligent things. And what makes that? I don't know. Northern countries? I don't know. That would be interesting to follow that up. Whoops. I'm going to mess up the TV thing here unless I put this back on. Let's see, it goes that way. Is it coming through? Okay, good.
Do you have any trend information about the U.S.? Are we getting better or are we doing?
I think we're getting a little better. As I recall, the statistics are that there are increasing numbers of atheists, there are increasing numbers of liberal religious people. People are moving out of the fundamentalist religions into the more liberal branches, and out of the more liberal branches into atheism, or into just not going to church, or not paying any attention to being non-religious, in other words. And so I think the trends are in the right direction in a lot of things. There's some real cultural change. The one that amazes me the most is the one about homosexuals right now in this country. It's really being widely accepted, and I think we're just using our brains and getting away from our old fears and stuff about sex and women and whatever it is that some church people seem to be worried about.
A couple of things. One thing real quick. To my knowledge, at least folks about our age and younger are apparently some of the least religious folks in our moderate statistical reckoning that we've ever seen. I was curious.
No, go ahead if you got some more like that. I'd like to hear, well, some more information I'd like to hear from others about, because I'm not an expert. You people know a lot of this stuff and can answer these questions too.
Well, I was going to ask, I know you're not the author of the paper you were passing around, but I was curious if you knew if there was any attempt to control for other factors, because I'm assuming that he would be aware that religiosity would not necessarily be the only thing to correlate with negative, social outcomes. The only reason I ask is the example of Japan. I know recently they're having a large problem with social upheaval, and many people in the age group of about high school through mid to late 30s completely eschewing relationships because they don't like the gender it, and so they just don't even bother. And they're having very serious problems with population shrinking and outlooks on that. And that's not like there's a necessarily religious cause.
Right.
But I was curious if there was any attempt to control for that or detect those sorts of things.
It wouldn't be a matter of controlling. He's simply trying to establish how religious are various nations. How religious is the culture in these 17 nations? And how socially functional or dysfunctional are these 17 nations? And he based it on these indicators. So he's not ruling out other causes. It's simply my opinion that religion is perhaps the strongest of the many causes of social dysfunction in this world. Fundamentalist religion, I think, seems to me to be pretty outstanding in its ability to mess things up. And I'm really impressed by that. And this study just backs that up. But he's not trying to prove this hypothesis that I just mentioned. And certainly in a country like Japan, which is apparently pretty non-religious, the causes of the various social dysfunctions are not going to be religion in Japan, or in Sweden, or in Denmark. So yeah, there are many other things that are going to be causative there. Pardon?
I'm sure any statistician would bristle at me ascribing cause there.
Right, right. And I try not to ascribe cause, but to indicate correlations and indicate that this forms a basis for a hypothesis of a cause. But I'm not sure you could prove causes like that socially. I don't know. I'm not enough sociologist to know. John?
I one time heard a definition of religion as faith unsupported by fact. And maybe this nation is disposed more than we know to be religious. For instance, our economical system based on the Chicago School of Economics, there is faith that it works, even though the facts have just demonstrated quite clearly the opposite for over 30 years. Yet you have this faith, a false religion that is destroyed.
Yeah, we got a strong inclination to follow our beliefs in this country, whether they're religious beliefs or economic beliefs or what. We've got a lot of ideologies in this country, things that we just believe, the way people believe some religious beliefs. And religion is not the only ideology by a long shot. And there are other pretty nasty forces out there that are along the ideological line that are really hurting us. And a lot of these are typical American beliefs. Yeah. See, I'm trying to think of another book that I liked a whole lot. Anti-Intellectualism in America. Nice study by Richard Hofstadter, written about 1965 or so. That's been a key book for me. I don't know, I love books, and some like this, they just mean a lot. And this is one that meant a lot to me. And we've got a strong ideological streak and a strong anti-intellectual streak in this country that this book brings out.
I've always thought that was kind of back to the religious part, where they're, in certain fundamental religions, they don't want you to think outside what their belief system is. So I've kind of put that whole thought of anti-intellectualism kind of also along with the fundamental religious.
You start thinking too clearly,
And then you might have church.
pretty soon you're going to disagree with our fundamental beliefs here. We can't have that. Don't think outside the box. Don't think for yourself. Don't think on the basis of evidence. That might disagree with my beliefs that I've got all carefully structured and feel so comfortable with. Sure. What are your ideas or observations about this? And you guys know at least as much as I do about this.
I can't remember the exact wording, but somebody asked a scholarly biologist, and I don't remember what her qualifications were and what her specialty was, but somebody said, well, do you believe in evolution? And she said, no. And what she said, but the evidence is so conclusive that evolution is the accurate process. that is what I understand.
Conclude, yeah. I try,
But you get rid of the belief part of it
Yeah.
altogether. I'm simply basing it on, as Marvin said, the evidence.
one of my little verbal tics lately has been to try to avoid the word belief. Just avoid it. I don't say I believe things. I conclude things. I think things. The free thinkers have a T-shirt that has a slogan. Think more, believe less, think more. Nice bumper sticker. Marvin.
Some people express that there may be a problem with in certain countries where the population is shrinking, as they say. Do you think that's a real problem?
It's a real problem, but it's a small problem compared to the humongous overpopulation problem that we already have. Yeah, it creates problems with age distribution, a large group of aged people with a small base of younger people trying to support their Social Security and things like that. There are problems when a country loses population, but we have much bigger problems right now from much bigger from overpopulation. I reckon that we're at about 3 times the carrying capacity of the planet right now. Certainly, we're overpopulated right now the way we're using resources. Perhaps if we all lived a Mediterranean lifestyle or an Indian, as in India, lifestyle, we wouldn't be overusing the planet the way we're obviously overusing the planet today. But at anything like a European American lifestyle, we got about 3 times the population this planet can really bear. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the best turns that any country has ever done for the planet, despite all its drawbacks, and I admit there are a lot of drawbacks and they should have done it differently in some ways, and it didn't nearly have to be as harsh as it was, but the Chinese one-child policy made a huge difference. It saved at least 500 million people. I mean, it's reduced the population of the earth by at least 500 million people today. In fact, that figure is an old figure. And you know, as the earth moves along, that 500 million of people who aren't here now, who would have been born, it gets bigger and bigger. And man, it just is killing us. Every country, they produce more gross national product and more food and everything. But then there's more people, and the more people outstrips the more food and the greater gross national product. And so countries like India, they have a nice growth rate and everything, but their people are overtaking that growth rate all the time, and so they have a hard time getting ahead ever. China's doing a lot better. I mean, it's amazing. There is a miracle going on in China. I know, and again, there's a lot of things they do there that I don't agree with, but they're doing some things right, because there has never been a time on this planet when that many people were brought up that far economically. It's a major miracle, if there are miracles.
Don't need to bother you. Some say that we're in the midst of the largest mass extinction species that the world has ever seen. But we're in the midst of it. The oceans are nearing a critical condition where they could collapse. What do you think about some of those almost 7 billion people being part of that mass extinction?
I hadn't looked at it that way. But yeah, as far as species are concerned, we're in the middle of what's called the 6th extinction sometimes by some people who think about it. There's a nice book called The 6th Extinction out there. And this is by a very good man. I forget his name now. He might be Leakey. Might be one of the relatives of Leakey. I'm not sure. Richard Leakey. Leakey's the great paleontologist that discovered the old bones in South Africa. And this is a grandson or something like that. 6th extinction, yeah, it's a terrible extinction of species, but you're asking about extinction of humans. Well, I don't know, if we have global warming and other catastrophes, that's just one, various other things that we're doing to this planet, including the extinctions of the other species, and I think that's going to hurt our well-being in the future also, and it already is. We're due for a population crash probably at some point. Most civilizations, as they meet various kinds of problems that they don't have the wherewithal to solve or aren't solving, they have a population crash at some point. And we're not going to become extinct though. We might drop out of civilized behavior though, or civilization as we know it. I can imagine civilization going downhill and having a decline and going back to the Middle Ages or something like it.
Does that,
Larry.
talking about that extinction,
Let me get Larry back here.
The gentleman who brought up the point about where did we miss the branching of nations less religious, he mentioned, I believe, Norway. Is that correct?
Denmark was, how did countries like Denmark become, how did they become less religious?
I had that same thing really bothering me 4 or 5 years ago when I was doing an overview of the situation of ignorance and religion and backwardness. And without claiming any sort of knowledgeability or expertise on other nations' religions, I came to 2 conclusions. In America, we make religion profitable. We always have.
Make it what?
Profitable.
Hmm.
And number 2, free exercise clause of the Constitution. And a religionist would be the last one, to buy what I'm saying, but because we have the free exercise of religion, we have a wider diversity, certainly wider than England, which is one religion for all practical purposes, the Church of England. And we've got 57 or 87 different, varieties. So there's 2 reasons, diversity and we made it profitable. If a religion starts closing down, like in England, the people lose a belief. It doesn't necessarily, evolve into something else. Here it's very easy for it to evolve into something else. Or devolve, whatever the case may be. But that's pure supposition on my part. I haven't done any detailed studies, but just from a general overview of looking at the nations that let go of religion, that don't embrace it very much compared to us.
Mhm.
Those are the 2 factors I could see. For one, the free exercise clause in the Constitution, giving diversity, and the second one, because of our tax code, it's literally profitable.
That sounds like good analysis to me. Yeah, and what you said about England holds in all of Western Europe. In Sweden, you're born Lutheran. You're just born, you're Lutheran. And that's one big reason why people turn away from the Lutheran Church there. They get sick of it. It's the state religion, and not that anybody practices it, and so everybody's given up on it. And actually, they're much more atheistic and non-religious than other countries because of that restriction on religion. Whereas here, we got all these religions. Yeah, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying here. Paul.
Well, you're talking social dysfunction in Scandinavia and Western Europe already experienced retooling of industry and agriculture, while here we've, in the last 20, 30 years, have experienced a rapid deindustrialization and consolidation of agriculture, which basically you're uprooting people's livelihoods, lives, and world outlook. And so what do you got to do? You look and, hey, this religion gives you some comfort. I've got to believe in something.
Again, social dysfunction tends to promote, despair, and despairing people turn to religion That's a hypothesis that Greg Paul thought came out of his study, natural hypothesis to suggest. Yeah. Yeah. And some of this is not for, some of that dysfunction is not out of religious reasons, for economic reasons. We've shipped a lot of our industry abroad and so forth, and so people are partly out of being displaced and are going to being short order cooks instead of building trains and automobiles. And that leads to despair, and then people turn to religion. However, we've been a very religious country for a long time. A lot of people who came here came seeking freedom of religion, so we got a natural bent in that direction. And at this point, I think it's hurting us.
So much of our lifestyle depends on relatively cheap energy, which causes another problem here of global warming. What's your idea of a way to keep that low-cost energy going?
Oh, well, it's a different topic. I'm real interested in this whole thing about energy, global warming. Well, I think the key thing is to set a price on carbon. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we're a little bit off the topic, but it's a heck of a good topic. Main thing, there's a one-stop solution on this. Not the solution, but if there's any most important part of it, is to put a price on carbon. Carbon's getting away free now. The oil companies, the coal companies and all, they're not paying their environmental overhead because there's no cost being placed on future global warming. There's no cost also being placed on, not much anyway, on the pollution of all these things and so on and so forth. And the one that's really missed the most is the global warming. We don't have that's no cost for global warming. You can cause that and it's free. So we turn to coal, and we turn to oil, and we turn to natural gas. If you put a price on carbon, it's going to discourage a lot of the use. The key to a whole lot of these economic injustices and imbalances is to include the environment in the price of the item. In a capitalist market economy, it's unfair not to include all the real costs, and the real costs include the environment, and they include people's welfare and so forth. You've got to build all that in if you're going to have a market economy. So that'd be my quick answer to that question.
Okay, about one more question. Anyone have a last question?
I'd stay all night, actually. But I love this discussion. I'm glad you folks are here.
So no more questions?
I was sort of hoping some fundamentalists would come and speak up. I'm happy to talk with fundamentalists, especially. Thanks, Larry. Yeah, I love to disagree agreeably. When it starts to get nasty, I'm gone. But nothing like a good discussion, among people who don't agree. It's great.
What is it in human nature that leads to fundamentalism? It's a strong.
The need for absolutes, I think. My answer, again, I'm not an expert, but it's a need for absolutes. We want things. A lot of people want things to be fixed. Yeah, that's why they don't like. A lot of people don't like evolution. It implies change. Physics is about energy. I'm a physicist. Physics about energy, and energy is roughly the capacity to cause change. So the universe is about change in a way, and I really believe that. We exist through changing, through doing, through being, not through just being fixed. Things are always changing, and if you're a full human being, I think you want to change as you go through your life. You evolve in your life, and you get better, I think. Most people do through experience. So I think it comes from the desire to stop change. We want eternity. We want things to be fixed and not move around and not suddenly become more socialized and so forth. Just keep it the way it was in the 30s. I came from the 30s and 40s.
Okay, did you have a question?
I was just going to say you skipped over that one over there.
I'm sorry? Oh, Phil?
No,
There was somebody back in the middle here who I think had raised a
That
question.
one, we kind of left that. I was going to ask if the writer of the sixth extension concludes that this mass extinction is the first one caused by the activity of one of the species on the Earth.
Yep. Yeah, he points that out very strongly. It is Richard Leakey, my memory comes back to me, and it is called The Sixth Extinction, and it's a wonderful book. It's one of the first, he was one of the first people to point out that we're in a major extinction of species now that compares with 65 million years ago, much faster than 65 million years ago, actually.
And the others have been caused by outside forces.
Yeah, an asteroid hit Earth
That's
down around Honduras.
This one seems to be falling on our shoulders.
Yeah, it's us. There's no question about that. And it's us that's made carbon dioxide go through the roof. And it's us that's making temperatures gradually rise. And if they keep rising as much as that carbon dioxide has risen, man, we're in trouble. And I think we are.
Okay, I guess we better call it an evening. And I'll just end by saying, if anyone has another idea for a Wondustry program, let me know. My contact information is on the program, and I think we ought to give Art a really big hand.
You too. Yeah.